The Democrats have long claimed to stand up for the common man ever since FDR passed the New Deal. But rhetoric and results are two very different things. In his latest article in American Greatness, Pedro Gonzalez writes about how voters are revolting against the managerial elite. So here to discuss is Pedro himself. Welcome back, Pedro.
Thanks for having me.
So I read your piece and I thought it was excellent. But for our viewers at home, what is managerialism and how does it tie into the bureaucratic fourth branch of government and the deep state that we always hear so much about?
Well, this is an idea that should be discussed over a lecture, I think. It's a very big thing. But the short version is basically that a lot of the social, cultural, and political independence that Americans just a few generations ago knew is gone now. It's effectively been eliminated and assimilated into the processes of big government. Every aspect of our lives is regulated and bureaucratized. There's a fun study by Robert Nisbet who wrote that before World War I, basically the only interaction that the average American had with the federal government was when they went to the post office, which I think is hard for us to imagine now, right? So that just gives you an idea of how massive this revolution in mass and scale has been. So really what this just means is that every aspect of American life is run by this credentialed class, these technically trained experts, whether they are pollsters or administrators at schools, they're federal employees, or they're employees in the state level. That's really all that means. People that we basically delegate tasks to instead of doing them ourselves. And it's just kind of, I think it's such a fact of life. It's so ubiquitous now that we really don't think about it. It didn't always used to be like this. Now the problem is that theoretically this kind of a system, all the managers, all these bureaucrats, all these pollsters are supposed to be disinterested, not hyper partisan. But that's just not the case. If you look at things like donations, if you look at party preference, people that work in media, journalists, I'm sure not you, of course, but most journalists, most people that work in media, most federal employees, they're overwhelmingly left-leaning. So basically, we're supposed to trust these people to manage the levers of power in virtually every aspect of life with disinterest, when in fact they hate people like us. They think that we need to be managed for our own good.
Exactly. And do you think that there's a political realignment now that's taking place? For example, in the Rust Belt, a lot of people who grew up for generations, their grandparents, their parents, and now they themselves have been voting Democrats because they're blue-collar workers, and that's what, union members do. They vote Democrat. But now they're being increasingly left behind by the Democrat Party that's increasingly being taken over by the far radical left, as you're talking about here, the elites, the managerial elite. Do you think that there's room now for the Republicans to become the party of the working class?
Yes, I think that there's no question in my mind that Trump was the first step. Trump affected a kind of realignment. Now the issue is whether the Republican Party realizes the implications of this realignment, or if it doesn't want to. I think that a lot of the aspects of the realignment of a working class movement threaten the traditional funding structure of the Republican Party. If you look at who donates historically to Republicans, it's people that want mass immigration because it means cheap labor, which is good for profits and bad for everybody else. Mass immigration creates competition for jobs and it suppresses wages. If you look at things like the foreign policy, I think this realignment also means a more restrained foreign policy, right? Well, that is kind of disruptive to the relationship that not just Republicans, but politicians in general have with the defense industry that really like to go to war because it's a very profitable business. So I think that is the real question, is after Trump, is this realignment going to stick? Or is the Republican Party going to say, thanks, Trump, thanks for the donations and the voters, but we're going to basically retcon the Trump moment into a justification for going back to the pre-Trump consensus that made the Republican Party irrelevant. So basically, thanks for making us not irrelevant anymore. We're going to use the relevance that you gave us to revive irrelevant ideas.
And we see that right now with some Republican senators such as Lindsey Graham and the rest of them who are staying quite silent right now as we see Democrats out in the open brazenly trying to steal this election away from President Trump. Oftentimes it really does feel like President Trump is the only one in Washington, Republican with an R behind his name, who's actually fighting and isn't afraid to get down and dirty with the left. So also we're starting to see some of the neocons, the rhinos, the wishy-washy Republicans kind of crawling out of the woodwork, almost like vultures saying, see, look, President Trump, he's done for, stick a fork in him, he's done, and this means the death of the populist right. Would you agree with those criticisms?
Yes, I think there's no question in my mind that the Republican Party wants to say goodbye to Trump. And I've been a critic of the administration not living up to its promises, but I'm 100% in Trump's corner right now because millions of good, decent Americans are investing all of their faith in Trump to prevent this election from being stolen. So when the Republican Party abandons Trump, they're abandoning them. They're abandoning their voters, the people that keep them in power, the people that donate to their candidacies. That is what the Republican Party is doing. It's basically saying we can't wait to get rid of Trump, and it'll be fine because we'll compromise with Joe Biden. And anyways, we got all these judges, so how much damage could he really do? That's basically what Mitch McConnell is talking about right now. I mean, there's reports of this in Axios. There's reports of this everywhere, really, that basically Republicans are trying to figure out a way to sell this as, well, it's not so bad. We promise that we'll keep Joe Biden in check. In other words, again, thanks for the votes, thanks for the money, but we're going to go back to the old Republican Party before Trump.
And one of the things that President Trump was able to show on Tuesday night was that he was able to amass more votes from minority groups from better than any other Republican going back to the 1960s. It does show that his brand of conservatism, it resonates with Americans of, all sorts of different demographics. So before I let you go, can you speak a little bit to the Latino vote and how President Trump was able to cut in a little bit on Biden there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with a kind of implosion of intersectionality. I think that the the Democrats going all in on Black Lives Matter, going all in on rioting, that did not work well with Latinos. You saw this because, of course, Dana Perino, Karl Rove, these mainstream conservatives were saying, well, it's because Latinos hate socialism. That might explain why Cubans in Florida voted for Trump in huge numbers, but it doesn't explain why Latinos in other places like Texas, especially so close to the border, voted really heavily for Trump. I really think it has to do, actually I know it has to do with the fact that the Democratic Party completely embraced the pro-crime message. And if you look at the data, poll after poll, survey after survey show that Latinos are pro-law and order. There was a Gallup survey that was conducted in late June, July, that found more than 80% of Latinos said they wanted more or the same police presence in their communities. Actually, Latinos were more likely than white respondents to say we want more police in our communities. So I think that, again, this was at least in part a kind of backlash to the pro-crime embrace of the Democratic Party. And the law and order message is very much a populist one. Sorry.
Oh, definitely. And I really do hope and pray that everything turns out well this week, or who knows how long this weird election limbo that we're in will take. But the future does look bright if President Trump is able to maintain his prominence here in the Republican Party. We're seeing a lot of good things happening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Pedro.
Thanks so much for having me again.